The restaurant was buzzing with laughter, couples clinking glasses, and families celebrating Christmas Eve. But in the far corner, one man sat alone. His suit was sharp, his watch cost more than most people's cars. Yet his eyes told a different story: emptiness. That's when a little boy walked up, clutching his mother's hand, and asked softly, "Do you want to have dinner with us?" The clinking of silverware echoed like a metronome inside the lavish restaurant. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a golden glow across tables filled with couples in elegant attire and families exchanging gifts. Waiters glided gracefully between tables, carrying trays stacked with champagne flutes and roasted turkeys garnished to perfection. But in the farthest corner, a single table remained different. At it sat a man whose presence demanded attention, though no one dared approach him. His suit was flawlessly tailored, stitched by the finest Italian hands. A platinum watch peeked out from under his cuff, ticking steadily with mechanical precision. Everything about him whispered success, and yet his eyes betrayed him. His name was Jonathan Hale, a CEO whose empire stretched across continents. Forbes had once called him the visionary who never sleeps. To the world, he was unstoppable. But tonight, on Christmas Eve, Jonathan was utterly alone. His phone lay face down on the table, an unusual gesture for a man whose life revolved around it. The screen occasionally lit up with notifications, boardroom updates, stock alerts, unread messages from assistants. But none of them mattered now. Not tonight. For the first time in years, Jonathan had no one to call. No family waiting at home. No partner across the table. Just silence, broken only by the occasional forced laughter from across the room. A waiter approached, pouring red wine into his glass. "Merry Christmas, sir," the young man said politely. Jonathan nodded, offering a half-smile, though his eyes never reached his lips. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built skyscrapers, employed thousands, and secured his name in history books of modern business. But in exchange, he had sacrificed something far more valuable: time. Time with his parents, whom he barely visited before they passed. Time with the one woman who once believed in him, but eventually grew tired of waiting for him to make time. Time with friends who slowly stopped inviting him, assuming he'd always be too busy. Now, his empire was vast, but his world was empty. He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the red liquid catch the light. Around him, laughter roared, glasses clinked, children giggled. Every sound only deepened the ache in his chest. Jonathan's gaze drifted to the entrance of the restaurant. A small family entered, a woman in a simple red coat, carrying a casserole dish wrapped in foil as if she had insisted on bringing something from home. Beside her walked a little boy, about 7 years old, with wide eyes that sparkled brighter than the Christmas lights hanging from the doorway. His laughter was infectious, even from across the room. Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. A memory stirred, long buried, almost forgotten, of himself as a child, tugging at his father's hand in a crowded diner on Christmas Eve. His father had been there, unlike now. That memory cut sharp. He looked away, back at his lonely table, back at the carefully plated gourmet meal that felt colder than the December wind outside. Jonathan told himself he preferred it this way. Alone, undisturbed, in control. But deep inside, a truth lingered. Success meant nothing if there was no one to share it with. And tonight, on Christmas Eve, that truth had never felt heavier. The little boy's laughter carried across the restaurant like a melody that cut through the clinking glasses and murmured conversations. Jonathan couldn't help but glance back at the family as they were guided by the hostess toward a modest table in the middle of the room. They didn't fit the grandeur of the setting. Not really. The woman's coat was worn at the sleeves, her shoes sensible rather than stylish. Her hair was tied back neatly, though strands fell loose as she ushered her son forward. A man followed close behind, likely her husband, balancing a shopping bag with a few small presents peeking out, wrapped in bright but inexpensive paper. Their table wasn't adorned with fine wines or extravagant decorations, but as they sat down, the warmth between them filled the air more than any chandelier ever could. Jonathan found himself staring longer than he intended. He noticed the way the boy tugged excitedly at his father's sleeve, pointing toward the tall Christmas tree in the corner of the restaurant. The man leaned down, listening with patience, his smile wide and genuine. The mother adjusted the boy's napkin, smoothing it across his lap with the kind of care that money couldn't buy. It wasn't wealth, Jonathan realized. It wasn't glamour. It was connection. A pang stirred in his chest. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to focus on his plate, a dish so artfully arranged it looked more like a museum piece than food. He cut into it mechanically, chewing without tasting. Across the room, the boy burst into giggles again, and Jonathan's knife froze halfway through. The sound was so pure, so unfiltered. It reminded him of Christmas mornings long ago, when joy came not from contracts signed or markets conquered, but from unwrapping a toy train beside a glowing tree. He blinked the memory away quickly. Memories were dangerous. They carried regret, and regret was something Jonathan had spent years burying beneath spreadsheets and skyscrapers. The family, meanwhile, had begun passing food around the table. The boy insisted on pouring water for everyone, spilling a little as he carefully lifted the heavy glass pitcher. His parents laughed, not with mockery, but encouragement. Jonathan caught himself smiling faintly before he realized it, and immediately his expression hardened. What business was it of his, after all? They were strangers. He was just another man dining alone. But strangers notice each other in ways no one expects. At that very moment, the boy's eyes lifted. Bright, curious, and unafraid, they landed right on Jonathan. For a brief second, it felt as if the entire room faded away. The boy tilted his head, studying the lonely man in the corner as though sensing something invisible, a sadness that no one else could see. Jonathan quickly looked down, pretending to adjust his napkin. But when he dared to glance upward again, the boy was still watching. Not with judgment, not with pity, just with a kind of innocence that seemed to ask, "Why are you sitting alone?" It was a question Jonathan didn't have the courage to answer. And yet, something in the boy's steady gaze told him, soon he would have to. Jonathan shifted in his seat, pretending to be absorbed in the restaurant's decor, the flickering candles, the snowflakes outside the window. Anything to avoid acknowledging the child's gaze that lingered on him. He wasn't accustomed to being studied this way. In the boardroom, people looked at him with awe, fear, or ambition. Rarely with curiosity, rarely with kindness. The boy whispered something to his mother, who glanced briefly in Jonathan's direction. She smiled politely, then shook her head gently, as if telling her son not to bother the stranger. But children have a way of ignoring the rules adults live by. Jonathan took another sip of his wine. When he set the glass down, he noticed movement at the edge of his vision. The boy had slipped from his chair, weaving through tables with determined little steps. Jonathan's chest tightened. Surely, he wasn't, but yes, he was. The boy stopped right at his table, standing small against the backdrop of Jonathan's expensive suit and towering presence. He looked up with wide, innocent eyes. For a moment, he said nothing, simply holding Jonathan's gaze as though searching for the right words. Jonathan cleared his throat, unsure of how to respond. "Hello," he said stiffly, his voice more formal than he intended. The boy hesitated, then smiled. "Hi." His voice was soft, but carried a sincerity that pierced the noise of the restaurant. Jonathan glanced around, expecting his parents to rush over to apologize for the intrusion. But they stayed at their table, watching cautiously, perhaps trusting their son's instinct. "Shouldn't you be with your family?" Jonathan asked, trying to sound detached. "I am," the boy said simply, pointing back toward his table. Then, with the kind of directness only children can manage, he asked, "But why are you sitting all by yourself?" Jonathan froze. No business rival had ever disarmed him so completely. His throat tightened, but words refused to come. He could have lied, brushed the boy off, claimed he was waiting for someone. Instead, silence became his only answer. The boy studied him for a moment longer, then did something Jonathan never expected. He tilted his head, smiled again, and asked, "Do you want to have dinner with us?" The words landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through Jonathan's guarded heart. He blinked, stunned. No one had asked him that in years, not genuinely, not without some ulterior motive. He opened his mouth, ready to decline, to explain politely that he was fine, that he preferred to eat alone. That was what he always said, wasn't it? Better alone than disappointed. But the boy's eyes, they were so earnest, so free of judgment. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt seen. Not as a CEO, not as a powerful man, but simply as a human being. He hesitated, the weight of 1,000 lonely nights pressing on him. His hand brushed the stem of his wineglass, but he didn't lift it. The boy waited patiently, unbothered by the silence. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the walls around him just beginning to crack. Jonathan sat frozen for a moment, the boy's invitation hanging in the air like a fragile ornament that could shatter if mishandled. Across the restaurant, the boy's parents watched, uncertainty written across their faces. The mother gave a small, apologetic smile as if ready to call her son back, but she didn't. She let the boy's words linger, waiting for Jonathan's answer. Jonathan had spent years making snap decisions worth billions. Acquisitions, mergers, stock plays that shifted markets. Yet here, confronted with one child's simple offer, he hesitated as though the wrong answer could undo everything he had built. Finally, with a breath he didn't know he was holding, Jonathan rose from his seat. His polished shoes clicked softly against the floor as he followed the boy back toward the family's table. Conversations around them carried on as normal, but Jonathan felt every eye in the room on him. The boy's father stood politely, extending a hand. "I'm Mark," he said warmly, his handshake firm but not forceful. "This is my wife, Anna, and you've already met our son, Michael." Jonathan nodded, shaking both their hands. Jonathan Hale, he introduced himself, his voice measured, though he knew the name carried weight. From a flicker of recognition in Anna's eyes, he suspected they knew exactly who he was. "Please," Anna said gently, gesturing to an empty chair. "You're welcome to join us." Jonathan sat, feeling oddly out of place at their modest table. It wasn't the expensive wood or the fine cutlery he was used to. Their table was crowded with dishes they had ordered to share, plates of roasted chicken, bowls of mashed potatoes, simple bread rolls. And right at the center, wrapped in foil, was the casserole Anna had brought from home. Michael beamed as he slid the bread basket toward Jonathan. "You can have the first one," he said proudly. Jonathan hesitated, then took a roll, its warmth seeping into his fingers. "Thank you," he murmured. The conversation began tentatively. Mark asked polite questions, how Jonathan's evening was, whether he lived nearby. Jonathan answered carefully, defaulting to the polished professionalism he used at corporate events. But the rhythm felt strange here, mismatched against the easy laughter between husband, wife, and child. Michael, on the other hand, wasn't interested in small talk. "Do you like Christmas?" he asked suddenly, his eyes wide with curiosity. Jonathan blinked. "I suppose I used to." The words slipped out before he could polish them. Michael tilted his head. "How can you used to like Christmas? It's the best day." Anna smiled softly, rescuing Jonathan from the weight of the question. "Michael loves this time of year. He spends days making decorations for the tree." Jonathan glanced at the boy, who nodded proudly. "I made the star on top all by myself." For the first time that evening, Jonathan chuckled, a small, genuine laugh that surprised even him. The sound seemed to soften the tension at the table. Still, as plates were passed and stories began to flow, Jonathan couldn't ignore the awkwardness lingering beneath the surface. He was a guest in a world he didn't understand, fumbling at the edges of warmth he hadn't felt in years. And yet, somewhere deep down, he wanted to understand it. At first, Jonathan spoke little, answering questions with short, polite replies. It was habit. Years of business dinners where every word carried weight, where misplaced comment could shift negotiations. But this wasn't a boardroom, and slowly, he began to notice that no one at this table expected him to perform. The casserole came out first. Anna unwrapped the foil carefully, releasing the rich aroma of baked cheese, noodles, and herbs. "It's nothing fancy," she said almost apologetically, but it's our tradition. Jonathan blinked at the dish. In his world, dinners were curated by Michelin-starred chefs, courses paired with rare wines. But the bubbling casserole, steaming with comfort, somehow made his chest ache more than any five-star menu could. "Looks wonderful," he said honestly. Michael grinned and piled a hefty spoonful onto Jonathan's plate before anyone else could serve him. "You'll like it. Mom makes the best one." Jonathan took a bite. The flavor was simple, hearty, and impossibly good. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd eaten food made with the intention of love rather than luxury. As they ate, conversation flowed more naturally. Mark shared a story about their disastrous attempt at stringing Christmas lights that year, how the entire display short-circuited after Michael insisted on plugging everything into one outlet. Jonathan found himself laughing, not the practiced chuckle he used in interviews, but a genuine laugh that left his shoulders lighter. Michael eagerly chimed in, recounting how he had helped, which mostly meant tangling himself in cords. Jonathan smiled, watching the boy's animated gestures, remembering his own childhood mishaps long ago. For once, Jonathan wasn't thinking about quarterly reports, deadlines, or stock values. He was listening, and strangely, he felt included. Anna asked him if he had family nearby. The question made Jonathan pause, his fork resting midair. "No," he said finally, his voice softer. "Not anymore." There was a brief silence, but it wasn't the awkward kind. Anna gave a small nod, her eyes kind, not prying. "Then we're glad you're here tonight." Something shifted in Jonathan's chest at those words. Simple, genuine acceptance. No contracts, no transactions. Just welcome. The conversation turned again, lighter this time. Jonathan surprised himself by sharing a small story, a memory of how his father once tried to fix a Christmas tree stand and ended up with the tree crashing sideways into the living room. He hadn't thought of that moment in years, but as he described it, Mark and Anna laughed warmly, and Michael burst into giggles at the mental picture. Jonathan felt something loosen inside him, a weight he didn't realize he'd been carrying. By the time dessert came, a modest plate of sugar cookies Anna had baked, Jonathan was no longer an outsider at the table. He was leaning in, listening, even teasing Michael gently about how many cookies he could eat in one sitting. The restaurant's buzz faded into the background. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't just present. He belonged. The plates were nearly empty now, crumbs of cookies scattered across the tablecloth, the casserole dish scraped clean. The restaurant had quieted, the clamor of earlier replaced by the softer hum of late-night diners finishing their meals. Outside, snow drifted steadily against the windows, muffling the world in white. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, almost surprised by how content he felt. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat through a meal without checking his phone every few minutes, without glancing at a clock, calculating time lost. Tonight, hours had slipped past unnoticed. Michael, sleepy but stubbornly fighting it, leaned against his mother's shoulder, still chattering about how next year he wanted to build the biggest snow fort ever. Anna stroked his hair, listening patiently, while Mark stacked the empty dishes at the edge of the table for the waiter. Jonathan watched them quietly, his chest heavy with an unfamiliar ache. It wasn't envy exactly, but a bittersweet longing. He realized he wasn't just watching a family. He was witnessing what he'd lost, what he'd abandoned on the climb to the top. Anna glanced up and caught his gaze. "Thank you for joining us tonight, Jonathan. It wouldn't have felt complete without you." For a moment, he couldn't speak. He cleared his throat softly, his voice rougher than usual. "No, thank you. You gave me something I didn't know I was missing." Mark smiled, steady and genuine. "Sometimes all a person needs is a place at the table." Jonathan nodded, the words sinking deep. As the family gathered their things to leave, Michael suddenly slipped from his chair and ran back to Jonathan. The boy held out one of the sugar cookies, the last one from the plate. "Here, so you don't forget us." Jonathan stared at the small gift, his throat tightening. Slowly, he accepted it, the cookie crumbling slightly in his hand. "I won't," he said quietly. Michael smiled, then darted back to his parents. They walked out together, coats pulled tight against the cold, their laughter fading as the restaurant door closed behind them. Jonathan sat there a while longer, the cookies still in his hand, his reflection staring back at him in the darkened window. For the first time in years, he didn't see the untouchable CEO. He saw a man who had been lonely, and who for one night had been found. Finally, Jonathan stood, leaving a generous tip on the table, and stepped into the snow. The city lights glowed against the white streets, but somehow the night felt less empty. He slipped the cookie carefully into his pocket, as if it were more valuable than the watch on his wrist. As he walked away, a faint smile touched his lips. This Christmas, he hadn't gained a contract, or a deal, or an empire. He had gained something far rarer, a reminder that sometimes the greatest wealth is simply being invited to the table.